Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. I'm host Nathan Kiker, and our guest today is Ken Rogoff. Ken is a professor of international economics at Harvard University and one of the most influential economic minds of the last several decades. Former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, Ken is perhaps best known for his definitive work on the history of financial crises. Beyond his work on debt and growth, he's been a pioneer in research on central bank independence and the future of currency, the themes he explores in his latest book, Our Dollar, Your Problem, which is out now. And what is surely one of the most unique dual careers in academia, he's also an international Grand Master of chess. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to see you, Nathan.
So there is a report this morning from the University of Michigan, an index, which was claiming that the U.S. economy is worse than it's been in 75 years. I have to say, I have a group chat with my friends, smart people, went to Columbia Business School, worked on Wall Street. There's a lot of debate. First, before we dive into specifics around your work, do you think the economy is worse than it's been in 75 years? And where is the economy today?
Well, I think people are unhappy, and you might talk about unhappier than in 75 years. That's hard to measure. But saying the economy is worse than we've been in 75 years, hard to know what that's calibrating. I'm nervous about AI. I'm nervous about, war and everything going on in the world. But, the hard numbers, even if you're just looking at the lower middle class, are hardly the worst in 75 years.
Speaking of hard numbers, there's also a lot of debate around if it's easier for Gen Z and millennials as opposed to their parents and grandparents. I'm 31. I certainly don't think the economy is easy. You have a couple years on me. Where do you think the economy is for people in my generation and people under 45 compared to where it has been over that period of 75 years?
Well, I definitely feel bad for Gen Z for a lot of reasons, but on an economic front, it's very hard to buy a house. And we live in a world where living in the distant suburbs, for lots of reasons, is less attractive. There are less jobs. There's less social life, less everything. And so, a long time ago, you move out to the suburbs, you have kids and nice garden and everything, and you feel you can drive smoothly into the city. You can't drive smoothly into any city I know. It's hours, the commute. And so kids feel blocked out. The prices of the houses are high. The interest rates are really high. And then on top of that, what certainly keeps me awake at night is thinking about AI. What do you do? Where are you going to be in 10 years? What path do you take? And I don't want to sound like a doomist, but I lean in that direction on it. Very, very hard to plan. You can say, you have to take the bull by the horns. You have to lead AI. You have to have the startup that cracks the code and is amazing. But okay, a few people are going to do that. That's not for everybody. And not everybody could succeed if they all tried. And so the stress level that your generation faces really is tremendous. I mean, I don't want to say the generation after World War II, they've gone through a war that was unbelievably bad. And when I grew up, we were kind of seriously worried about getting nuked. I mean, that was like a thing. When I was, in grammar school, in like second grade, we would learn how to hide under our desks and stuff. But it didn't feel real, the way that some of these things are. So, it's hard to compare across generations, but I would not say that Gen Z has it easy.
Well, one of the proposals that's very loud and prominent is for UBI. You are a proponent of austerity, or you have been in the past. Is there a world where UBI, one, is affordable and two, is possible in the age of AI?
Well, let me take that on. I have never been a proponent of austerity. That's polemic misrepresentation. During the financial crisis 15 years ago, I advocated writing down debt for subprime mortgage holders. I advocated, Bill Clinton cited my work in his book. I advocated writing down the debts of small countries. I advocated using inflation. However, we did show in our work that when your debt is really, really high and it's good to spend money, it's not good to owe money. And some, the almost idiotic progressive thread came on that if you thought it was bad to inherit a big debt, that was terrible thinking, you were a terrible person. And that's just nonsense. It's a trade-off between what you want to spend and how much you owe. I love universal basic income. I think the future has to have something like a value-added tax on everything. That's like they have in Europe. I know that's a bad advertisement, but they actually have a better tax system than we do. Maybe, okay, this is really futuristic, but it's what a lot of my colleagues think, that an ideal tax system would have very high, it's like a sales tax, but it's more sophisticated. That's regressive, but you go back, you give it back by having a universal basic income. I think something like that's in the future. There are questions about how much of it should be in the form of in-kind food stamps and stuff. But, I think that's where we're headed in this AI world. And, okay, there are all sorts of complaints you can read from the Wall Street Journal. That's Marxism. But it looks to me like, a very small number of people are going to get all the gains from AI. And, what else do you do? I don't think anything's politically stable other than that. I don't think anything's fair. So, yeah, on the other hand, you can't just take our current system and throw universal basic income on top of it because there's no money for that. Debt is not a free lunch, which, again, going back to this polemic thing that debt is free, you never have to worry about it, which, by the way, I think the last 5 or 6 years have educated some people about, and a lot of people have reversed their views. I think you have to, go to a completely different system. But yes, we can afford it. We're a very rich country.
Before we talk about your work on the dollar, let's talk about the debt. So, again, you were laying out ideas for how to handle the debt around the financial crisis. U.S. debt today is at an all-time high, but so are the debts of other countries in the world. So, to sort of make this, without being reductive, what does that actually mean for the global financial system if every country is basically every country is running both a large deficit and a large debt? Why does that matter in total? And then specifically, why does that matter for U.S. consumers?
This takes us back to the free lunch era again from 10 or 15 years ago, when, not surprisingly, after the financial crisis, interest rates collapsed because everybody was very skittish. Everybody was hiding from everything and wanted to hold debt and didn't want to owe money. And now that's reversed. Obviously, there's a lot of euphoria in the stock market, but also debt did go up and up and up. And contrary to the view that it's a free lunch, interest rates have gone up. And that's, a problem. Sort of who's it worse for is a bit of a question. We'll see. You could easily argue that France is in the worst shape because they not only have really high debt, really by some measures higher than ours, they have taxed to the limits. I mean, they have way higher taxes than the US. We have the capacity to tax more if we want to. And, people are going to complain about it, but at least it's an option. But I think politically, this is very hard, even in the United States, where we are phenomenally wealthy. And it's not like we need to have a problem with our debt. We can't sort it out politically. The Republicans don't want to tax anyone. The Democrats don't want to tax anyone but the upper 1%, which is just not going to pay for everything. A fine place to start. And, we have to be able to do something about it. And that's why I think we will have a debt crisis. I think that's the next thing to come. I don't think you can convince the voters that you have to do something until they really see, blood on the street, so to speak. So the last time in 2008, that was a private sector debt crisis, not a public sector debt crisis. But we put a lot of public sector money into reversing it. And I think we're going to come to a point where we'll see a problem. I don't know where we'll see it first. UK, France, Japan, could be the United States. I tell you where it's not going to be. It's not going to be in the emerging markets that we're defaulting all the time, because their voters know they can't just spend till they're blue in the face, never do anything about it. They've seen it. And so even though their wealth is a fraction of ours and their incomes are way lower than ours, it's much easier in those countries for their leaders to say, look, we have to either lower spending or raise taxes or do something. And right now in the rich countries, the mentality is, we're like immortal teenagers. Nothing can ever happen to us.
This may be a little reductive, but you were saying we can't basically tax our way out of it by placing taxes on the wealthy. I will say, via my work, I've spent a lot of time with very wealthy people, and the common thread is they're not that smart, and they also do have more money than they need. Income inequality is as high as it's been since the French Revolution. Why can't we tax them into a place that's more equitable and progressive?
Well, let's tax them, but it doesn't solve our debt problem. Like, the order of magnitudes are just not that big. What's particularly problematic about the AI revolution is that labor share is falling. That's why stocks are going up. But are we going to be able to tax Elon Musk? Are we going to be able to tax these people? So we could certainly have a fairer tax system. And we started out with what I think would be the most a line you could draw of a value-added tax with universal basic income. Unfortunately, politically, it's so hard. These people, you're familiar from working in the Democratic Party. It's the same in the Republican Party. These people are immensely powerful politically. They pay for your ads. They pay for your campaigns. They pay for everything. Latin America is a country that's where we're headed. They already have inequality like we're headed. And everybody says to them, you should have progressive taxation. We said that when we were at the IMF. Why don't you? And they would say, one person, I think a Harvard professor once commented, getting progressive taxation in Latin America is like riding a bicycle to the moon. It's just not going to happen because same thing. These rich people are too powerful politically. You have to solve that in order to tackle the problem. But obviously, it's a complete absurdity that Warren Buffett was paying a lower tax rate than his secretary, like as he commented. It's ridiculous. And I think some of the soon-to-be trillionaires would never be able to do that if they were just paying the tax rates that a steelworker is paying. And we're not even talking about progressive. The system's very regressive, and it's not easy to fix. I mean, I'm sure the Democrats have been more active on this, but I think when centrist Republicans have risen up on it, they've gotten beaten down badly.
What do you think about the arguments around Mayor Mondami's potential tax increase on very wealthy folks in New York? Do you buy that capital flight is a real risk?
Yeah, he has his head in the sand. I mean, that's just not going to work. It's going to cost more money than it makes. You need to do this at a minimum at a federal level and have a way of locking people in. Yeah, I mean, maybe for a couple of years, people won't leave as quickly, but, there's been a tremendous flight to Florida, Texas, et cetera, from California and New York. That's been hurting the tax base, and it's sort of nice rhetoric, but there are a lot of things. Again, providing free housing to everybody. Okay, if you're the United States and you have some kind of reasonable immigration policy and you want to get to a point where you're providing housing for everybody, that's great. But if you do it as a city, I tell you, I used to teach at Berkeley, And this was in the late 80s. And Berkeley had just an incredibly generous system, even compared to San Francisco, even compared to the rest of California. And it was just like an absurdity. It was a magnet for everybody. I would listen to people talk outside the coffee shops, how they rushed to Berkeley. You need to do it at a federal level. I have the impression, I think Mondami's actually very smart. I mean, he's a very savvy politician, but he strikes me as a very smart guy. And I gather, listening to some of his deputies and lieutenants, they kind of get it. But he had some rhetoric in the campaign. He has to follow through with it. And I think if he did nothing, that would look bad too. I kind of get it why he's doing it, but it's not going to be a resounding success.
Fair enough. Let's turn to your work around the dollar's decline and what it means for geopolitics, which, of course, is the focus of our show. Peak dollar in the geopolitics of decline. Look, you, in your research, have spent a lot of time talking about how the dollar basically peaked with its dominance around 2015. What does that actually mean in plain terms for the average American? And what does it mean for U.S. foreign policy and our leverage around the world?
It's a fantastic perk the United States has, that the dollar is essentially the lingua franca of global trade and the global financial system. We as Americans don't even get it. Like, we kind of get, if any of your listeners and viewers travel abroad, people will take dollars. If you're going the other direction, they're not even taking Swiss francs here. If somebody tried to pay at Starbucks with Swiss francs, which frankly is a better currency than the dollar in a lot of ways, forget it. They wouldn't do it. Canadian dollar, well, I mean, that would be like a joke. I used to live on the Canadian border growing up when things were a little more equal. So it's an incredible privilege. You can price things. It's very, very convenient. But there are other factors, which is that because the world is using the dollar so much, it means foreigners hold a lot of that debt we were talking about, maybe almost a third of it. That's a chunk other countries don't have, of having that extra demand. That lets us rack up a bigger debt without paying a higher interest rate as we would. In fact, your interest rate on your mortgage is 1% lower than it would be otherwise if the dollar wasn't king. It's that big an effect on your car loan, on your student loan. It's not just Uncle Sam. But what really riles the rest of the world is the geopolitical factor, because everybody needs to use our banking system. I call it our back office. In ways I can't even explain. It's partly because the dollar is king. It's partly because we've been the military superpower and we kind of force the rules to be at our convenience. It's partly historical circumstance. But we have a lot of control over how transactions are done. So you're in Europe, you're French, you're buying a present for your parents in Lithuania, or frankly, could be UK or Poland. There is a fair chance that transaction, even though, what does the United States have to do with it? That if President Trump really cared about you and really wanted to know what you were spending, he could see it, because so much goes to us. You think the Europeans hate that? Think of how the Chinese feel about it. And then we have weaponized it. That was happening way before Trump. Trump brought in the tariff as an additional weapon. But I don't think there's any doubt that when the day comes when Trump moves on Greenland, the Europeans know he's going to use financial sanctions. So why do you care? Because, suddenly it's just harder to do everything. You need the U.S. financial system. So that it's an incredible advantage to us. And we've somewhat abused it, which has China pulling away and Europe starting to pull away. And also because we think we're immortal and we think we can just never have a problem, both parties, and I would say equally both parties, think when they're in power, they can just run debt till they're blue in the face. And when they're not in power, debt's terrible, but when they're in power, they can run debt till they're blue in the face. And it also say both parties, not just Trump, when they're in power, have moved to undermine central bank independence, which is a little bit of a anchor on this, because if you can't inflate, then you have to think of something else to pay for all this. So I feel our total dominance is very much in doubt. And I must say, I finished my book, Our Dollar, Your Problem. I didn't know who'd win the election. I had a academic press the book. I think it's written for a very wide audience. It's had a very wide audience, but they don't care about money at all. They just sat on it, and they didn't release the book till Liberation Day, after Liberation Day. That was just a coincidence. And everybody came to me and said, how could you know? How could you have the timing like that? But things like Liberation Day, the war in Iran, all of these things are undermining our position. I don't think we can walk them back easily.
Let's talk a bit more about the Fed's independence. Of course, there's signals that it's fragile. What does that mean? And do you actually think it is at risk of becoming much less independent via the current White House and future White Houses?
I absolutely think it's at risk and has been for some time. It is a relatively new idea. We used to be pegged to gold. In fact, really until 1970, the dollar was redeemable for gold by governments. Back in the 30s, you and I could redeem neither of us are around, but you could redeem your currency for gold. In fact, it said it on your dollar bills, redeemable for gold. And that was an anchor. And when we got rid of that in 1971, when Nixon shed that because it was getting in the way of the spending he wanted to do for the Vietnam War, continuing the Great Society, getting himself reelected, he just found it inconvenient. And we went through a horrible decade of inflation until we figured out central bank independence. I think I wrote the first theoretical paper about that, of how it worked. And so it's relatively new. And in other countries, it's newer. The UK only had central bank independence since Tony Blair came in, and I think it was 1997, many countries later than that. Inflation came down, and now a lot of people have forgotten how we got here. They think, oh, well, inflation's not a problem. I'd like interest rates to be lower. I'd like, the government funding to be cheaper. I'd like loans to be cheaper for people. There's a lot of short-term pressures. So I think it's by no means something that could withstand sustained pressure. The Iran war is actually a pretty bad shock, but something like that times 4 in terms of what we need to spend, that would really blow us out of the water. It would push interest rates up. Very tough to meet the spending targets without using inflation. And by the way, when you're having a war, it's okay to use inflation. I mean, you have to be practical and consider heterodox policies. I'm not, saying it's the end of the world. But I think we'll find central bank independence coming under assault more and more as we look around the world. We'll see. I mean, we're in a situation where things are drifting for the worse in many ways. Maybe AI will just magically save everyone. Maybe not. So I tend to think we're, going to have central bank independence under a lot of pressure going forward, and not just because of, sort of a president who doesn't want anyone independent of him.
When you were helping lead the IMF, you were obviously advising emerging countries who many of them ended up actually making the central bank not independent. What happened to those countries now, and why would that be different for the U.S., if at all?
Well, I mean, there's a whole mix of things. So I think when I was there, a lot of countries were starting to make their central banks independent and not, they didn't have independent central banks back then. What's different about the United States is we supposedly have better institutions. I'm sure you talk about this in your program every day. I mean, that's what we have. We have the rule of law. And when you start to have these institutions fray, either because the president believes in unitary executive power and nobody's prepared to do anything about it except a little bit the courts, or frankly, had the Democrats won a sweep, my impressions, they wanted to get rid of the filibuster, which would have had 5 people running the country instead of 1, but something kind of similar. This is just a breakdown of our institutions. I understand the reasons on each side they feel they need to do it, but once you go in that direction, I think it's much harder to protect these softer institutions. Central bank independence is not in the Constitution. It is a convention. It's been done because it works. It's not something that could stand up. If Trump had the support of Congress, he could get rid of the Fed in a week. He could bring it back into the Treasury. He could get rid of all the jobs. Thankfully, he doesn't. Not even the Republican will go for that. I don't know, a few might, but he doesn't have the support of the Congress. But someday, a war going on, things going the wrong way, it could drift in another direction. Also I'll say this facetiously, a Mamdani presidency, you don't know what hits, and it could be convenient to take it away. It could be done. And I think central bank independence is something the central bankers have to fight for every day. It's not to be taken for granted.
You have spent the time to study 8 centuries of governments and investors and economies. Where is the U.S. right now compared to these historic countries and their economies? What are we the most comparable to today, and what do you think is going to come within the next 10 years?
Well, overall, the U.S. economy is amazing. You mentioned that a lot of people aren't happy and think it's the worst in 75 years. I think, on the contrary, it's the most amazing economy in history. However, there are fragilities. Certainly, people are relying on artificial intelligence to solve all problems. And I'm more of a doomist in this area. I think, okay, maybe 100 years or 20 years, but I see risks that it creates more problems than it solves. Lost jobs, social media, fake Nathans, fake Kens, fake everything. We've had this in social media, but just easy to do, much worse. The ability of bad actors to have access to unimaginably potent weapons, cyber weapons. I mean, just to pick an example, Catherine Bigelow had this wonderful movie, House of Dynamite. Maybe some of your viewers saw it, where we end up literally having World War III. And you never quite know, were the missiles build up and things they were seeing on their screens a shadow? Was it something that was a cyber hack? Well, we have AI with the capacity to do these things, especially in conjunction with bad actors. I know maybe I'm sounding crazy. I would worry about these things. So I would like to slow AI down. I think our economy is a little too wonderful right now.
Can we talk about that a little more? This is a debate I've had for a while, and I think anyone who has seen Dune has this fear as well. Can you slow AI down? And how does that happen, especially with a conflicted federal government? Because here's my thinking on this, which is if you were alive in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, your day-to-day did not change that much, and you could learn and become an expert. For example, you could be one of the foremost economists in the world. But now, every single time you're on LinkedIn or Twitter, there's this great new AI tool you have to master within the next 24 hours or you're screwed for life. But how do we slow down AI, and is that possible?
I think it is possible. I think it's not too late. Let's start by enforcing intellectual copyright laws and intellectual property protection, which has just been cast to the wind. Everybody's book, I don't know if you have one, but everybody's book you can sort of get through any of the AI programs. Maybe they paid a tiny license fee, like a library would pay, but they serve it to tens of millions of people, intellectual property rights. If we could form the Nathan Ken Company and we were allowed to take anybody's IP, and it's just as long as we change it like a little bit, we can sell it, we'd make a fortune. I mean, I don't know if I'd know how, but maybe we'd hire my spouse is a much better business head than I have, and she'd figure out how to do it. But that's part of what's going on. They're stealing all this stuff. What's the argument? And by the way, here's an area where I think if Harris had been elected, it would have been a lot slower. They would have had to worry about regulation. They would have had to worry about the environment. And Trump just cast these things to the wind. Okay, what was his argument? His argument, it sounds good. We have to compete with China. China's going to do it if we don't do it. And I want to say, I just think this is nonsense. First of all, we can't stay ahead of China. Anything we invent, they will get within a couple of months. We're not going to get 5 years ahead of China in this. They have too good cyber hacking. They can use old-fashioned espionage, lots of things. There's, as you know, Mythos or whatever it's called. It's leaked, like everything's going to be like that. So we invent it, it's going to spread. So I had a former student who works in this space of AI safety. And I said to her, she, about your age. And I said to her, aren't you worried China's going to get it first? And she said, well, what's the point? So that the United States can be responsible for ending the human race instead of China? I think it's a terrible mistake, and we have to work with the Chinese. I think it was a mistake not to regulate social media. I think it was just a terrible mistake. This is the same mistake, and the dynamics are the same. The group gets rich, they control the politics, they control the campaigns, and you can't do anything about it.
Yeah, that's right. I want to briefly hit on crypto, which is something you've spent a little bit of time covering. Specifically, you've just published research comparing today's stablecoin regime under the Genius Act to the chaotic free banking era of the 1830s. That's a really stark historical warning. What specifically concerns you about the Genius Act and crypto today?
Well, one thing that concerns me is that there are going to be a lot of these things are called stable coins, which is they're not bad in and of themselves. Currency is good. It's not bad. But the Genius Act envisions having lots of them, and a lot of them are going to go bankrupt. It's going to cause problems. I actually think the bigger problem is that they're too focused on having people really want it and not focused enough on how easy it will be to evade taxes, to evade, all kinds of regulation. I understand the Genius Act is supposed to try to get around, deal with this. But I want to say I don't think it does. I think it doesn't go far enough. Stablecoins are a great invention. It can be done, but I'm not sure that they're quite going to be what people envision. The way it's set up, they're just supposed to be like cash, like having a $100,000 bill or a $10,000 bill. Yeah, there's a big demand for that. But there's a reason, again, President Nixon back in the 70s banned it, and we haven't brought it back. So there's a lot of interesting issues around crypto. One thing I want to add, Nathan, is that I don't hold with those like Warren Buffett, I've mentioned, Paul Krugman, Jamie Dimon, many others who said it's worthless. It's really fundamentally worthless. That's wrong because, for example, Bitcoin's government resilient. There are people, what do you know, who don't want the government to know what they're doing. It's a very big part of the economy. I've studied it a lot over my career. We call it the underground economy. I would say it's 20% of the world economy, $25 trillion a year. They use crypto. They absolutely use it. Arms sales, human trafficking, drugs, mostly tax evasion. Russia and China trade in crypto. Russia and India trade in crypto. Iran's been doing all their trade in crypto. Hezbollah did all their business in crypto. That's a demand. You can decide it's not legitimate, but it's there. So it's an interesting space. I think that there's a lot to say about it. but you have to be careful if people have something to sell and they, want you to buy their product. They want the government to regulate things so that it's favorable. And, it's, I think, important not to have our politicians get bought.
I would agree with that. 2 final questions for you. If you were advising the next U.S. president, Republican or Democrat, on the single most important step to preserve U.S. financial leadership in the world, what would you advise them to do?
Oh, I think a simple answer to that would be central bank independence. That there's a lot of complicated things. This is not a complicated thing. The rest of the world trusts our money because we don't lightly make it worth a lot less. And I actually recently spoke to the Prime Minister of Japan, and that's exactly what I said when she was asking for one piece of advice, and I would say the same.
Final question: If this has been kind of a gloomy conversation, not because you're gloomy, but because your analysis of the financial world is slightly gloomy. Are there any reasons to be optimistic about the U.S. economy and global economic growth over the next generation?
Well, I think I am optimistic about growth. I'm not as optimistic about our social fabric, geopolitical stability, where it will lead. We're growing really well. The Trump economy, it's about the same as the Biden economy. He said that was the worst economy ever, and his is the best economy ever. They look exactly the same to me, in a lot of ways. And it's been the envy of the world, and hopefully will continue to be. But, our undoing, if it happens, will be, what your show is about, trying to reach some kind of consensus when you see these problems a long time in advance to face them. And I will tell you, I think you must know that it's very hard being a centrist. Like I've had people on the right, say that I'm a bleeding heart Harvard liberal. People on the left, say that I'm austerity and, super conservative. And, you just use name calling sort of instead of engagement. And we can't function in that world.
Very good. Ken, you've generously given us almost 40 minutes of your time. For our listeners, where can they follow your scholarship and your work?
Well, I mean, I have a column that's monthly in Project Syndicate. I'm on radio and TV a fair amount, and you can find some of this on my webpage at Harvard. But most importantly, I have a book that came out not so long ago. The paperback version's just coming out, Our Dollar, Your Problem. That's been a bestseller and I think reached a very wide audience. And whether you agree with it or not, I think you would find it enjoyable.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.